What's the scariest true story you know? Story number 1. I grew up in a funeral home. I helped out in the office. When I was about 15, we got a call from a man whose wife and infant baby had been murdered in cold blood. There were very few clues. It made headlines. Cops set up surveillance at the viewing. It was heartbreaking as the mother was holding the baby in her arms. I was asked to take the flower cards and periodically get the husband and ask if he recognized the names. I then photocopied them and put them back. I did it because I was a kid, people knew me, and I was unobtrusive. I talked to the husband quite a bit. He seemed devastated and shaken. The cops told me they had an eyewitness to someone leaving the house the day of the murder. The witness was a 3-year-old girl. She recognized the man leaving. It was the husband's best friend. Turns out that the friend and the husband had made a pact to kill each other's families and run off with their secretaries. The little girl identified the friend, and I guess one of them cracked. They both went to jail on multiple counts, all on the testimony of a 3-year-old. I still cannot believe to this day that that man stood right beside me multiple times and I had no clue. I don't think I ever looked at life the same way after that. Story number 2. My great-aunt woke up in the middle of the night. She heard her dog making these low growls. She was single at the time and living alone in her ranch-style home. She walked out to her living room to check things out. She didn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary, so she decided to make sure her door and front windows were locked. Door was locked. First window she checked was locked. When she lifted the mini blind on the second window, it was wide open and a guy in a ski mask was standing there. She said he laughed this evil laugh and said, "Party time," then he started to climb in. She screamed that she had a gun. Her dog started barking his head off. The would-be rapist decided to bolt. My aunt did get a gun after that and learned how to use it. I can't even think about what would have happened to her if she didn't have her dog to warn her. Story number 3. James Bolter. He was just 2 years old and with his mom running errands. She let go of his hand to pay the cashier, and he wandered away. 2 10-year-old boys spotted him, lured him toward them, took him by the hands and led him away. They took him to a remote location, pushing and kicking at him the whole time. Some people questioned the 2 kids with the crying toddler, but they lied saying he was their brother, and nobody intervened further. They took him to a secluded spot and tortured him. I don't want to recount the torture details, it's just too gruesome. They left his body on some railroad tracks, hoping that being run over by a train would make it look like an accident. He was found days later, his body severed in half by a train. The boys were caught and became the youngest convicted murderers in British history. Security footage from the day they took James shows them watching children picking out a target, and they were just kids themselves. They were released at 18. One of them is back in jail for possessing child abuse photos on his computer. The most terrifying thing about this for me is that my own son is only 2 now, and James's murderers were just children too. It was premeditated and intentional and entirely random. Just a momentary lapse in attention, and he became a target of 2 murderous children. Children. To think that children younger than my stepson are capable of such a thing. Everything about this case is just horrifying. Story number 4. The scariest true story I know is my own. I grew up with a very mentally ill and abusive father. The summer I was 16 and my younger brother was 13. My father shot my brother with a shotgun at almost point-blank range in our basement. Thankfully, it missed his heart by 2 inches, and he is still alive today. I came home that evening to find my stepmother cleaning the blood off the tile floor like there was nothing to see. It was the most terrifying and surreal thing I've ever experienced. One would believe attempted murder would be enough to terminate custody rights, but alas, the police chalked it up to accidental, and my brother and I were too frightened of our father to say otherwise. At 18 and 15, respectively, my brother and I packed up and left the state, never to speak to our father again. To this day, little bits of shrapnel still surface in my brother's chest. Story number 5. I had a guy tell me a story a couple decades ago about how he was hiking in an area in South America and wandered away from other hikers in the area. The ground was wet, and without warning it gave away, and he got sucked into a fast-moving underground river pitch black, completely submerged and at the mercy of the current as it buffeted him against the sides of the tunnel. After some time, the current subsided, and he realized he was in a larger pocket, still pitch black and submerged. He said that even as he struggled to hold his breath, he didn't panic and realized that the water had to keep moving somewhere, so he moved around until he found another tunnel that sucked him in. At one point, he began to see light, so he punched upwards, broke through the ground, and pulled himself out, soaking wet, gasping for air, and a bit of a distance from the other dry hikers, who were somewhat bewildered when they saw him straggling up to them. Story number 6. Everything to do with Haj Muhammad Mesfui. He was a shoemaker who lived in Morocco in the late 19th and early 20th century. He and his accomplice, a 70-year-old woman called Anna, used to drug and kill young women who came to the shop. Eventually, one of the victim's parents traced her movements to the shop, and after the remains of 36 mutilated corpses were discovered nearby, Mesfui and Anna were questioned and tortured. Anna didn't survive, but Mesfui confessed to murdering them, usually for a tiny amount of money. His initial sentence was crucifixion, a very unusual punishment even then. However, there were many protests from powerful foreign embassies, and Morocco couldn't do much against them. Instead, he was sentenced to beheading, a more common punishment. However, the mood in Marrakesh was that this was far too lenient, so they settled on immurement, being walled up alive. A special cell was constructed in the wall of the bazaar, about 2x2x6 feet. Chains were attached to one wall to ensure he would be kept standing. Mesfui wasn't told of his fate until the morning of his execution, when he was led, screaming, in chains and slowly bricked up inside. Once the last course had been laid, the crowd would fall silent until he started screaming when they would cheer. He screamed nearly constantly for 2 days. On the third day, he fell silent. Story number 7. I served a short stint as a fireman. There was an RTA call one morning, 30 minutes after I started my shift. This guy got T-boned while driving home after a night of heavy drinking. He got T-boned on the passenger side when he ran a red light. His wife died instantly, and he pretty much remained unharmed. When we arrived at the scene, he was outside his car, while the wife was still seated in the passenger seat. Her lower body was still in her seat, while her upper torso splayed over to the driver's side. Looks like she was just reaching over to the driver's side to open the door, just that she's unconscious and non-reactive. No blood at all from what we can see from the driver's side. The passenger's door was caved in badly. The driver was still tipsy and thought nothing of what's happening, kept asking us to hurry up and extract his wife so that they can head back home, laughing and fumbling around with the police. When the paramedics realized that there was no pulse, we tried extracting her from the driver's side, and we realized that her lower left body, her left pelvis to her thigh, was completely crushed, and she was impaled through her left abdomen by a piece of the door. When we told him that his wife has died, probably bled out minutes after the impact, you could see the disbeliefs slowly morphing into realization, then ending up as desperation. He was immediately sober and ran over to the driver's side, trying to pull his wife out. It tore her wound up, and we had to drag him out. He then proceeded to the passenger side and tried to pry the caved door open. We left the scene then and let the police handle the aftermath. Saw it on the news that afternoon. Story number 8. The kidnapping of Colleen Stan. She was hitchhiking in the 70s and turned down rides because they didn't seem safe. A van with a young couple and a baby offered her a ride, and because it was a family, she accepted. They held her at gunpoint, put a giant box on her head that blocked out noise and sound, and later kept her in box the size of a coffin underneath their bed. She was brutally beaten and whipped daily for 7 years. They also brainwashed her to believe that they were part of a mafia called The Company that would kill her family if she tried to escape. Eventually, the wife helped her escape and received immunity for testifying against her husband at trial. The case is known as The Girl in the Box. Story number 9. I lived next to a murderer. Faye Swetlick was 6 years old when she was kidnapped out of her front yard. It was all over the news. I had news crews, cops, even the FBI all over my townhouse complex. My husband and I met with the FBI 3 times. They searched our home and everything. I remember clear as day, my husband FaceTimed me as the cops were digging through the trash cans directly in front of my townhouse. They pulled out her boot and a bloody knife. Then they found her body, dumped maybe 300 feet from my house. He had watched them find the murder weapon. Mass put it in a trash bag along with his other mail. He went to his back porch and opened his own throat. It's crazy. I had conversations with the guy. I never knew he was a psycho. This all happened a year ago.